There's a special kind of pain when your own children look you in the eye and tell you you're no longer welcome. Mark Ridley, 60 years old and newly widowed, felt that pain the night his kids asked him to leave for good. With nowhere to turn, he drove to his late Aunt Eleanor's old house, a place he hadn't seen in decades. The house sat empty in the hills, covered in snow and memories. Mark thought he'd find nothing but cold rooms and loneliness. But behind a locked door, he discovered something his aunt had hidden for years. Something that would change everything he believed about his family. What was Eleanor keeping from everyone? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The headlights cut through the darkness as Mark Ridley's truck climbed the winding road into the hills. Snow had started falling an hour ago, and now it covered everything in a blanket of white that seemed to muffle the world itself. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, knuckles pale in the dashboard light. He'd been driving for 3 hours, and his mind had replayed the same conversation over and over until the words had worn grooves into his memory. "Dad, this isn't working anymore." That had been Brian, his son, 35 years old, an accountant with a nice house in the suburbs and 2 kids Mark barely saw anymore. Brian had stood in the living room, Mark's living room, the house he'd shared with Claire for 3 decades, and delivered the verdict like he was reading from a quarterly report. "You need to move on. It's been 8 months. 8 months since Claire died. 8 months since Mark had held her hand and watched the light fade from her eyes. 8 months that felt like 8 days, and 8 years all at once." Denise had been there too, his daughter. 32, a high school English teacher with her mother's gentle eyes, and apparently none of her patience. She'd stood beside her brother, arms crossed, her expression somewhere between pity and frustration. "We've tried to be understanding," she'd said, "but you're not even trying, Dad. You just sit here surrounded by Mum's things, living in the past." Living in the past, as if the past wasn't all he had left. The argument had escalated from there. Words he wished he could take back, words they'd probably like to reclaim too. But the end result was the same. They wanted him out. Not forever, they'd said, just until he got himself together. Found a grief counselor, maybe. Started acting like himself again. The problem was, Mark didn't know who himself was anymore without Claire. The GPS announced he'd reached his destination, and Mark slowed the truck as the house came into view. Aunt Eleanor's estate. He hadn't been here in over 20 years, not since he was in his late 30s, and had brought Claire and the kids for a brief visit those summer. Eleanor had been in her 70s then, still sharp as a tack, moving through the old house with the kind of quiet grace that made you want to sit still and listen when she spoke. She'd died 5 years ago, at 94. The house had passed to Mark's father, Eleanor's nephew, but he'd never done anything with it. He'd died 2 years later, and somehow the property had ended up in legal limbo until the estate was finally settled last year. The lawyers had tracked Mark down, informed him that as the sole surviving heir in his line, the house was technically his if he wanted it. He hadn't wanted it, hadn't wanted to deal with it, had filed the papers away and forgotten about them. Until 3 hours ago, when he'd needed somewhere, anywhere, to go. Mark pulled up to the front of the house and killed the engine. The silence was immediate and complete. No traffic sounds, no neighbors, no voices telling him what he should be feeling or how he should be healing. Just wind and snow and the creaking of old trees. The house stood 2 stories tall, a 1920s manor that had probably been quite grand in its day. Now it looked tired, windows dark, paint peeling in places, but the structure itself seemed sound. Eleanor had always taken care of things. Even in her 90s, she'd arranged for basic maintenance through some kind of trust. The utilities were supposedly still connected. Mark grabbed his duffel bag from the passenger seat. He'd packed in a rush, throwing in clothes and toiletries without much thought, and made his way to the front door. The key was supposed to be under the third flower pot on the porch. That's what the estate lawyer had told him, at least. He found it exactly where it should be, cold and slightly rusted, but functional. The lock turned with some resistance, and then he was pushing the door open, stepping into darkness that smelled of dust and time and something else. Something that reminded him of his childhood, though he couldn't quite place what it was. Mark found the light switch by memory more than sight. The overhead fixture flickered, then held, illuminating a front hallway that looked frozen in time. Furniture covered in white sheets like ghosts, hardwood floors dulled by years of neglect, but still intact. A staircase leading up into shadow. He closed the door behind him and set his bag down. The house was cold, but not freezing. The heat must still be on, set low to keep the pipes from bursting. Small mercies. Mark moved through the ground floor slowly, pulling sheets off furniture, opening doors, reacquainting himself with the layout. The kitchen was outdated but clean. The sitting room still had Eleanor's reading chair by the window. The library, Eleanor had always called it, the library, though it was really just a room with built-in bookshelves, was exactly as he remembered it. Books lined every wall, their spines faded, but proud. Photographs covered the mantel above the fireplace. Mark approached them, carefully, as if they might disappear if he moved too quickly. Eleanor as a young woman, dark-haired and serious, wearing what looked like a nurse's uniform. Eleanor with other women, all in similar uniforms, standing in front of a large tent with a red cross on it. Eleanor with his father as a boy. Eleanor with Mark himself, maybe 8 years old, both of them standing in the garden behind the house. He picked up that last photo, studied it in the lamplight. He'd forgotten about that visit, forgotten how Eleanor used to let him help her with the gardening, how she'd tell him stories about plants and birds and patience, how she'd never treated him like a child who needed to be managed, but like a person whose thoughts mattered. "You were always kind to me," Mark said to the empty room. To Eleanor, wherever she was. "I should have visited more." He set the photograph back on the mantel and continued his exploration. In the kitchen, he found the cabinets still stocked with canned goods, their expiration dates long past, but somehow comforting in their presence. Eleanor had always kept a well-supplied pantry. "You never know when someone might need a meal," she used to say. The refrigerator was empty and unplugged, but the stove looked functional. Mark made a mental note to pick up groceries tomorrow if he decided to stay. If, as though there was anywhere else to go. He climbed the stairs to the second floor, each step announcing his presence with a creak. 4 bedrooms lined the hallway, plus a bathroom with fixtures that probably dated back to the 1950s. The master bedroom at the end of the hall still had Eleanor's furniture, a large bed with a carved wooden head frame, a dresser with an oval mirror, a writing desk positioned beneath the window to catch the morning light. Mark dropped his duffel on the bed and sat down, suddenly exhausted. The events of the day pressed down on him like a physical weight. The desk caught Mark's attention. It was the kind of desk that invited correspondence, with small drawers and compartments built into its design. Mark stood and crossed to it, running his hand along the smooth wood. A layer of dust came away on his fingers. He tried the top drawer. It stuck at first, swollen from years of humidity, but yielded with some gentle persuasion. Inside, he found the ordinary detritus of a life: pens that no longer worked, paper clips, rubber bands gone brittle with age. But beneath these items lay something more substantial: a leather-bound journal, its cover worn soft with handling. Mark lifted it carefully. The leather was dark brown, almost black, and between some of the pages he could see the pressed shapes of flowers, their colors faded to brown and gold. He opened to the first page and saw Eleanor's handwriting, precise and elegant even in what appeared to be a personal diary. January 3rd, 1943, the first entry began. Today I reported for duty at the 45th General Hospital. I am terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. The other nurses seem so confident, so certain of their purpose. I wonder if they feel as unready as I do, or if I am the only one who lies awake at night, wondering whether I have the strength for what's coming. Mark sank into the desk chair, the journal open in his hands. 1943. Eleanor would have been in her early 20s then, just starting her service as a wartime nurse. He'd known she'd served, of course, everyone in the family knew that much, but she'd never spoken about it in any detail. Never shared what it had been like, what she'd seen, what she'd felt. He read entry after entry, watching Eleanor's words chart her transformation from uncertain girl to confident professional. She wrote about the other nurses, about doctors who worked miracles with too few supplies, about soldiers who joked even as they died, determined to make their passing easier on those around them. And then, in an entry dated March 7th, 1943, a different tone entered her writing. There is a soldier in Ward C who looks at me as though I am the only real thing in a world gone mad. His name is Lieutenant Whitmore, though he insists I call him Jonathan. He was brought in 3 days ago with shrapnel wounds to his leg and side. The doctors say he'll recover fully, given time and rest. He says he'll recover faster if I'm the one changing his dressings. I told him that was medically inaccurate. He smiled and said some things can't be measured by medicine. I find myself thinking about that smile at odd moments throughout the day. Mark smiled himself, recognizing the sound of someone falling in love despite all intentions to remain professional. He continued reading, found more entries about Jonathan, how he'd been a teacher before the war, how he read poetry and could quote entire passages from memory, how he'd grown up on a farm in Iowa and missed the smell of turned earth in spring. The entries stretched late into the night as Mark sat reading, unable to stop. He watched Eleanor's love story unfold across the pages, Jonathan's discharge, his return to duty, the letters they exchanged, the war's end, their plans for a future together. When Mark finally looked up, pale morning light was filtering through the windows. He'd read through the entire night without realizing it. His back ached from sitting in one position for so long, but he barely noticed. He was lost in Eleanor's story, in this window into a life he'd never known existed. He stood stiffly and walked to the bedroom window, looking out at the snow-covered grounds. Somewhere in this house was the rest of Eleanor's story. He could feel it, the way you feel a presence in a dark room. There were more secrets here, more pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known he was solving. Mark made coffee in the ancient kitchen percolator and stood at the window, watching dawn break over the property. His phone buzzed with messages from Brian and Denise, but he ignored them. Whatever they had to say could wait. Right now, he needed to understand what Eleanor had left behind. After breakfast, he returned to the master bedroom and began a more systematic search. In the closet, he found a small wooden box tucked behind Eleanor's shoes. Inside were several old keys on a ring, some folded papers, and a tarnished silver locket. Mark opened the locket with careful fingers. Inside were 2 photographs, faded but still visible. On the left, Eleanor in her nurse's uniform, young and serious. On the right, a handsome man in military dress with kind eyes and a slight smile. He turned the locket over, engraved on the back, "To my dearest E, until we meet again. J.W. Jonathan Whitmore." Mark unfolded the papers next. One was a letter, addressed to Mark in Eleanor's familiar handwriting. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. "Dear Mark," it began, "if you're reading this, you've come home. This house and everything in it is yours now. But more than that, the truth is yours. Behind the East Wing door is my real life, the one I could never share. I'm trusting you with it. You were always the one who understood. The key with the blue ribbon opens the door. What you find there will answer questions you didn't know to ask. Be kind to my memory. But more importantly, be kind to yourself. You deserve a second chance at happiness. Love always, Aunt Eleanor." Mark looked at the ring of keys. One had a blue ribbon tied through its loop, newer than the others, as though Eleanor had added it specifically for this purpose. He walked through the upstairs hallway with new awareness, looking for the door Eleanor had mentioned. At the end of the hall, he found it. Heavy oak with ornate brass hinges, a door he'd barely noticed the night before. Mounted beside it was a small brass plaque. "Private ER." Mark fitted the key with the blue ribbon into the lock. It turned smoothly. He pushed the door open and stepped into a room that took his breath away. Unlike the rest of the house with its dust and neglect, this space was pristine. A sitting room, perfectly preserved, furnished in the style of the late 1940s. Photographs covered every wall. Eleanor and Jonathan, together and separate, documenting their wartime romance. A writing desk sat by the window. A cedar chest rested at the foot of a small daybed. This was Eleanor's secret, the part of her life she'd sealed away from everyone. The love story she'd never been able to share, preserved like flowers, pressed between the pages of a book. Mark stood in the doorway, overwhelmed by what he'd discovered. Eleanor hadn't just left him a house. She'd left him her heart, her history, her most private grief, and love. And somehow, she'd known he would need it. Mark spent the next 3 days living between 2 worlds. The present, where he heated canned soup and ignored increasingly urgent messages from his children, and the past, where he pieced together Eleanor's hidden life through the artifacts in the East Wing. The room was a treasure trove of preserved memory. Mark found bundles of letters tied with string, dozens of them, correspondence between Eleanor and Jonathan spanning their entire relationship. He read them chronologically, watching their love deepen through words exchanged across an ocean, across a war, across the uncertainty of whether they'd survive to build the future they planned. Jonathan wrote beautifully. His letters were filled with observations about the men he served with, descriptions of landscapes scarred by war, philosophical musings on mortality and meaning. But threaded through everything was his devotion to Eleanor, his certainty that she was what he was fighting to return to. "My dearest Eleanor," one letter read, dated November 1945. "I'm writing this from a dreary office in Belgium, counting the days until I can see your face again instead of just your photograph. The brass keeps finding reasons to delay discharges. But I promise you, I'm doing everything in my power to expedite the process. I dream about the house we'll buy, the garden you'll plant, the mornings I'll wake up beside you. That dream is what kept me alive through the war, and it's what keeps me sane now, during this interminable peace." Eleanor's copies of her own letters revealed her matching devotion, though her words were more practical, more grounded. She wrote about her work at the hospital, about saving money for their future, about looking at properties where they might settle. She'd found this very estate, Mark realized, had identified it as the perfect place to build their life together. March 1947, Eleanor had written, "I've found it, Jonathan. The house I've been searching for. 40 acres backing onto forest, a manor house that needs work but has good bones, a creek running through the property. I can see our life here so clearly, you teaching at the local school, me working at the hospital, evenings on the porch watching the sunset. I've made an offer. By the time you come home, it will be ours." But Jonathan never came home. Mark found the telegram tucked between the letters, its words stark and bureaucratic. "The Department of War regrets to inform you that Lieutenant Jonathan Whitmore was killed in a training accident on March 18th, 1947. Further details to follow." A training accident. 3 weeks before Jonathan was supposed to return to Eleanor, 3 weeks before they would have started the life they'd been planning for 4 years, and a senseless accident had taken him. Mark sat in the quiet room, holding the telegram, feeling the weight of Eleanor's devastation across the decades. He understood that feeling, the cruel randomness of death, the way it made no sense, followed no logic. Claire had survived raising 2 children, decades of marriage, countless small dangers, and then cancer had taken her in 8 brutal months, despite every treatment, every prayer, every desperate bargain Mark had tried to make with a God he wasn't sure he believed in. In the cedar chest, Mark found a wedding dress wrapped in tissue paper, ivory silk, simple but elegant, with delicate lace at the collar and sleeves. Eleanor had bought it in anticipation of Jonathan's return. Had it made or purchased it ready-made, preparing for a wedding that would never happen. Beneath the dress lay more treasures, a framed photograph of Jonathan in full dress uniform, Eleanor's nursing cap from the war, a small box containing Jonathan's military decorations sent to her after his death, and at the very bottom, a leather-bound ledger that made Mark's hands shake as he opened it. The ledger documented charitable giving, starting in 1950 and continuing for decades. Eleanor had taken Jonathan's death benefits, perhaps $20,000, a substantial sum in 1947, and invested it carefully. Then she'd used the returns to help others. Medical bills paid, scholarships funded, families in crisis supported, all of it documented in Eleanor's meticulous handwriting, all of it done anonymously. June 1952, one entry read, "Thompson family, surgery for son's clubfoot, what $200. The mother cried when the hospital told her an anonymous donor had covered the costs. I thought about Jonathan, about how generous he was, how he would have wanted his death benefits used to help people. This feels right. This feels like honoring him." Page after page of entries, hundreds of thousands of dollars given away over the years. Eleanor had lived modestly in this big house, driven an old car, worn practical clothes, and quietly transformed lives with the money Jonathan had left her. Mark's phone rang, startling him out of the past. Denise's name appeared on the screen. He answered this time, unable to ignore her any longer. "Dad? Oh, thank God, we've been so worried. I'm fine, sweetheart. I'm sorry I didn't call sooner. Where are you? Are you really at Aunt Eleanor's?" Mark looked around the east wing, at the photographs on the walls, the letters scattered on the desk, the evidence of a love that had shaped Eleanor's entire life. "I am. And Denise, I've found something remarkable. Eleanor had a whole life we never knew about." He told her about Jonathan, about the wartime romance, about the tragic death and the decades of charitable work that followed. Denise listened, asking occasional questions, her voice softening, as the story unfolded. "That's beautiful and heartbreaking," she said finally. "Why didn't she ever tell anyone?" "I think the pain was too private, too deep to share." Mark paused. "I understand that now, more than I did before. Dad, Brian and I, we need to apologize. The things we said, asking you to leave, we were wrong. You were scared. You were watching me disappear into grief and didn't know how to help." "That doesn't excuse it." Denise's voice caught. "Mum died, and we made it about us instead of supporting you. Your mother's death was hard on all of us. We all handled it badly." Mark stood and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered grounds. "But I think I'm starting to find my way. Being here, learning about Eleanor, it's helping me understand something important." "What's that?" "That grief doesn't have to destroy you. It can transform you if you let it." After the call with Denise, Mark felt steadier. He spent the afternoon exploring the rest of the house more thoroughly, no longer just moving through rooms but really seeing them. Each space held clues to Eleanor's life, small details that revealed the woman she'd been. In the library, he found her collection of poetry books, many with passages underlined. Jonathan had loved poetry, Mark remembered from the letters. Eleanor had kept reading it after his death, maintaining that connection. Pressed flowers marked certain pages. Flowers from the property, Mark guessed, each one a small memorial. He found more photographs tucked into books. Eleanor, at different ages, always alone or with groups, but never with another man. She'd devoted her entire life to Jonathan's memory, had never allowed herself to love again. Mark thought about that as he made dinner. More canned soup, eaten standing at the kitchen counter. Was that devotion or fear? Loyalty or self-imprisonment? Eleanor had clearly wrestled with the question herself, based on the journals he'd been reading. She'd acknowledged her loneliness, recognized what she was giving up, but never quite managed to change course. His phone buzzed with a text from Brian. "Denise told me what you found. Can we visit this weekend? I'd like to see where you are." Mark hesitated, then typed back, "Yes. Come Saturday." He spent the next 2 days preparing for their visit, cleaning the house more thoroughly, making up guest rooms, buying proper groceries from the small town 15 miles away. The town was quaint, barely changed from what he remembered from his childhood visit. People were friendly in that way. Small town people often are with strangers, curious but not intrusive. At the hardware store, an elderly man behind the counter studied Mark when he gave Eleanor's address for the delivery of some repair supplies. "You're staying at the Ridley place?" "I'm Mark Ridley. Eleanor was my great-aunt." The man's expression softened immediately. "Floyd Patterson. I knew Eleanor for 40 years. Fine woman. We all miss her. Did you know her well?" "As well as anyone did, I suppose. She kept to herself, mostly. But she had a good heart." Floyd leaned against the counter. "My grandson was born with a club foot. Needed multiple surgeries, special equipment, therapy. The costs were crushing us. Then one day, Eleanor stopped by, casual as anything, and before she left, she'd written a check that covered everything. Wouldn't hear of being paid back." Mark felt his chest tighten. "When was this?" "Oh, 20 years ago now. My grandson's married, got kids of his own, works as a physical therapist. I think Eleanor's kindness inspired him." Floyd paused. "You planning to stay out there?" "I'm thinking about it." "Good. Eleanor would have wanted the house lived in, not just locked up." Mark left with his supplies and Floyd's phone number, told to call if he needed help with anything. Back at the house, he made small repairs, fixed a loose floorboard, replaced a washer in a leaky faucet, tightened the handle on the front door. The work was simple but satisfying, a way of caring for the house that felt like honoring Eleanor. Friday evening, he returned to the East Wing and discovered something he'd missed before. Behind the writing desk was a filing cabinet, its drawers unlocked. Inside, Mark found property documents, investment statements, and tax returns going back decades. Eleanor had been wealthy, not extravagantly so, but comfortable. She'd invested Jonathan's death benefits wisely, added her own nursing salary over the years, and watched it grow. By the time she retired in the early 1990s, she'd built a portfolio worth several $100,000, and she'd given so much of it away while living like someone with far less. Mark found a folder labeled Current Holdings with statements from just before Eleanor's death. He added up the numbers with growing astonishment. Even after decades of charitable giving, Eleanor's estate was worth over $800,000. His phone rang. Brian. Dad, we're planning to leave early tomorrow. Should be there by 10. That's fine. I'll have coffee ready. How are you doing? Really? Mark looked around the East Wing at the evidence of Eleanor's hidden life spread across every surface. I'm discovering things about our family I never knew, about love and loss and what we do with grief when it threatens to consume us. That sounds heavy. It is. But it's also helping me understand something I needed to understand. Which is? That surviving loss is possible. That meaning can be built from devastation. That we have choices about what our grief becomes. Mark paused. Eleanor lost the love of her life and spent 70 years honoring that love by helping others. She made something beautiful out of something terrible. And you think you can do that? I think I have to try. Saturday morning arrived, clear and cold. Mark was up early, making coffee and breakfast preparations, when he heard Brian's SUV pull into the driveway. He walked out onto the porch to greet them. Brian and his wife Anne, their 2 children, Denise and her husband Paul, with their daughter Sophie. The children tumbled out first, excited by the grand house and snowy grounds. The adults approached more cautiously, their expressions uncertain. This was the first time they'd seen Mark since the argument that had driven him away. Dad, Brian said, stopping at the bottom of the porch steps. Hello, son. Come in. All of you. I want to show you something. Mark led them through the house, telling Eleanor's story as they walked. He showed them the library with its collection of poetry and pressed flowers, the sitting room where Eleanor had lived her quiet life, and finally, the East Wing, the preserved sanctuary where Jonathan's memory lived in photographs and letters, and the wedding dress that was never worn. Denise stood in the center of the room, slowly turning to take in the photographs covering the walls. Tears streamed down her face. She loved him her whole life. She did, Mark confirmed. And when she couldn't have the life she'd planned with him, she used his death benefits to help others, turned her grief into something that made the world better. Brian picked up one of Jonathan's letters, read it carefully. This is remarkable, Dad. She was remarkable. I'm learning that. I'm also learning something else. Mark pulled Eleanor's letter to him from his pocket, the one that had urged him not to seal himself away. Eleanor regretted her isolation. She warned me not to make the same mistake. The family spent the morning exploring the house and grounds. Mark showed them Jonathan's memorial in the woods, the clearing with its stone bench and granite marker. Denise sat on the bench for a long time, reading the inscription, processing the weight of Eleanor's decades-long devotion. It's beautiful, she said finally, but so lonely. Yes, Mark agreed. That's exactly what it is. Back at the house, over lunch, They talked more openly than they had in months. Brian apologized formally for asking Mark to leave. Denise apologized for judging how he grieved. Mark apologized for shutting them out, for being so consumed by his own pain that he couldn't see theirs. "Mum was our mother," Denise said, her voice thick with emotion. "We lost her too. And then we felt like we lost you. You didn't lose me. I just got lost for a while." Mark looked around the table at his family. "But being here, learning about Eleanor, I'm finding my way back." After lunch, while the children played upstairs, Mark showed Brian and Denise the filing cabinet, the investment statements, the ledger documenting Eleanor's charitable work. "She left all of this to me," Mark said, pulling out the will he'd found. "The house, the land, the money, all of it." Brian's eyes widened as he scanned the documents. "Dad, this is nearly $1 million. 800,000, give or take. What are you going to do with it?" Mark had been thinking about this constantly since discovering the will. "Continue what Eleanor started. She left instructions, families she was supporting, scholarships she was funding. I can't just abandon those commitments." "That's a huge responsibility," Denise said. "It is. But it's also purpose, and I need that right now." Mark pulled out the list of Eleanor's ongoing charitable commitments. "There are families depending on support," she promised, "students counting on scholarships. I need to honor those promises." Brian studied the list with his accountant's eye. "This is doable, but you'll need to structure it properly. Set up a foundation or trust, get legal and tax advice. I can help with that if you want. I'd appreciate it." They spent the afternoon discussing logistics, making plans, sketching out how the Eleanor Ridley Foundation might work. Denise offered to help research recipients and vet applications. Anne suggested ways to expand the giving beyond Eleanor's existing commitments. Even Paul, normally quiet, contributed ideas about community outreach. Mark watched his children engage with Eleanor's legacy and felt something shift inside him. They were building something together, creating meaning from loss, not just his loss, but Eleanor's as well. 3 generations connected by grief, transformed into purpose. That evening, after the family had eaten dinner and the children were watching a movie in the sitting room, Mark took Brian and Denise to the library. He'd set up a display of Eleanor's medals and commendations, which he'd found earlier that week, hidden in a box under a floorboard. "There's more to her story," Mark said. "Things even I just discovered." He showed them the medals, decorations for bravery under fire, a Purple Heart for injuries sustained during an air raid. He showed them the citations describing Eleanor running into burning buildings to save wounded soldiers, pulling 3 men from a collapsing field hospital during a bombing. "One of those soldiers was Jonathan," Mark explained. "She saved his life in 1944, only to lose him 3 years later." Denise traced her finger over the Purple Heart. Why didn't she ever tell anyone? Why hide this? I think she saw it as just doing her job. The war was full of people doing extraordinary things. Maybe to her, it wasn't worth mentioning. Mark paused. Or maybe talking about it meant talking about Jonathan, and that was too painful. Brian picked up a photograph of young Eleanor in her nurse's uniform, bandaged but smiling, standing with other nurses in front of a field hospital. We never really knew her, did we? No. But we have the chance to honor who she was, even if we didn't know it while she lived. Later, after everyone had gone to bed, Mark sat alone in the East Wing. He'd been reading more of Eleanor's journals, particularly the entries from her later years. In them, he found increasing references to regret, not about Jonathan, but about the life she hadn't allowed herself to live afterward. April 15th, 1998, one entry read. Floyd asked me to dinner tonight. Not chess and coffee, but an actual dinner. I could see what he was offering. Companionship? Maybe more. I said no. I always say no. It's easier than risking my heart again, easier than admitting I'm lonely. But is easier the same as better? I'm 73 years old, and I've spent 51 of those years alone by choice. Was it the right choice? I loved Jonathan completely, but he's been dead longer than he was in my life. Would he want this for me? Would he want me to have spent half a century maintaining this vigil? I'll never know. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, I wonder if I made a mistake. Mark closed the journal and thought about his own choices. He'd been alone for 8 months, and it already felt unbearable. Could he imagine 70 years of it? Building a meaningful life, yes. Helping others, yes. But doing it all alone. Eleanor's warning echoed in his mind. Don't do what I did. Don't seal yourself away. His phone buzzed with a text from Denise. Can't sleep. You up? In the East Wing. Come down if you want. A few minutes later, Denise appeared in the doorway, wrapped in a robe. She sat beside him on the small daybed. This room, she said softly. It's like a time capsule. Eleanor preserved everything, every letter, every photograph, every piece of Jonathan. She kept it all locked away where no one could see it. But she wanted you to see it. Yes, and I think I'm starting to understand why. Mark showed Denise the journal entry he'd just read. She regretted her isolation. She wanted to warn me against making the same choice. Denise read the entry, wiped her eyes. Are you going to listen? I'm trying to. It's hard, though. The thought of opening up to anyone, of risking that kind of loss again. I know. But Dad, you have to at least try. For yourself. For Mum's memory. She wouldn't want you to spend the rest of your life alone. Sunday morning, Mark's family prepared to leave. The children were reluctant, having transformed the vast house into their personal playground. Brian pulled Mark aside as they loaded the vehicles. I meant what I said about helping with the foundation. I'll connect you with a colleague who specializes in charitable trusts. She'll help you set everything up properly. Thank you, son. And Dad? Brian's voice softened. I'm proud of what you're doing here. Mum would be proud too. After they left, the house felt quieter, but not empty. Mark spent the afternoon continuing his exploration of Eleanor's papers. In a folder marked Property Maps, he found a hand-drawn diagram of the entire estate. Eleanor had marked various features: the house, Jonathan's memorial, the formal gardens. But one notation caught his attention. E's garden, where I talked to him. A different garden from the memorial. Somewhere Eleanor went specifically to maintain her conversation with Jonathan. Mark bundled up and set out with the map, following a faint path that led south from the house. After 20 minutes of walking through woods, he emerged into a small valley. Before him lay an extensive garden, dormant but clearly once carefully tended. Raised stone beds arranged in geometric patterns, trellises for climbing plants, a small wooden shed near a creek. Mark approached the shed slowly. The door wasn't locked. Inside, garden tools hung neatly on walls, a potting bench beneath a window, and in the corner, a simple chair beside a small table. On the table lay a gardening notebook. He opened it carefully. The entries dated back decades, documenting what Eleanor had planted, when, and with what success. But interspersed with the practical notes were more personal observations. May 3rd, 1975. Planted the roses Jonathan loved today. White ones, like the flower he sent me from France. I told him about my day while I worked, about the patient who reminded me of him, about the robin's nest in the eaves, about the way the light falls through the trees at evening. I know he can't hear me, not really, but saying the words aloud makes me feel less alone. Mark sat in the wooden chair, the notebook open on his lap. This was where Eleanor had maintained her daily relationship with Jonathan. Not in the formal memorial with its granite marker, but here, in this working garden where life grew and changed and demanded attention. Here she'd talked to him about ordinary things, had included him in her daily existence. It was heartbreaking and beautiful at the same time. Mark stayed in the garden for an hour, walking the paths, imagining what it must look like in summer, when everything bloomed. Eleanor had created something remarkable here. Not just a memorial, but a living space of beauty and purpose where memory and present life intertwined. When he returned to the house, he felt something crystallizing inside him. He understood what Eleanor was trying to teach him through all these discoveries, that grief didn't have to be static, didn't have to freeze you in place. It could be dynamic, could be transformed into something that honored the dead while still engaging with life. Over the next week, Mark threw himself into practical work. He made necessary repairs to the house, fixed leaking gutters, replaced broken window panes, repaired loose boards on the porch. He met with Patricia Chen, the attorney Brian had recommended, and began the process of establishing the Eleanor Ridley Foundation. "Your aunt was remarkably organized," Patricia said during their first meeting, reviewing Eleanor's records. "Most people who do informal charitable giving leave a mess behind." But she documented everything: who received what, why, what the outcomes were. This makes our job much easier. Mark worked with Brian to reinstate all of Eleanor's ongoing commitments. The scholarship payments resumed. The medical bill assistance started flowing again. The housing support continued. He sent personal letters to each recipient, explaining that Eleanor had passed away, but her commitments would be honored. The responses overwhelmed him. Letter after letter arrived thanking Eleanor, sharing how her generosity had changed lives. A young woman wrote about finishing nursing school because of Eleanor's scholarship, about accepting a position at a veterans' hospital. A father wrote about his wife's cancer treatment, about how Eleanor's assistance had allowed them to focus on healing instead of drowning in debt. Mark read each letter carefully, feeling the weight and beauty of what Eleanor had accomplished. She'd touched so many lives, created ripples of positive change, all while living quietly in this house. But he kept coming back to Eleanor's warning about isolation, about the danger of building walls so high that nothing could get through them. Eleanor had helped countless people, but she'd done it from a distance, always maintaining her separation, never letting anyone truly close after Jonathan died. On a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after his family's visit, Mark's doorbell rang. He opened the door to find Floyd Patterson standing on the porch, leaning on a cane. "Hope I'm not intruding," Floyd said. "I was in the area and thought I'd check on how you're settling in." Mark invited him in, made coffee, and they sat in the library. Floyd looked around the room with obvious affection. "I was here many times over the years," he said. "Eleanor and I had a standing chess game every Thursday afternoon for nearly 20 years. I didn't realize Eleanor had close friends. She kept her circle small, but the friends she had, she valued." Floyd sipped his coffee. "I heard you're continuing her charitable work, setting up a foundation. Word travels fast. Small town. Plus, some of the families she helped have been talking. They're grateful." Floyd set down his cup and looked at Mark directly. "But that's not really why I'm here. I'm here because Eleanor asked me to come." Mark straightened. What do you mean? She left me a letter to be opened 1 month after her death. In it, she predicted you'd end up at this house. She asked me to wait a few weeks after you arrived, then come talk to you. Floyd reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope. She also left you this. Said I'd know when the time was right to deliver it. The envelope was addressed to Mark in Eleanor's handwriting. Mark took it with trembling hands, set it aside for a moment. She also asked that I tell you something first, Floyd continued, about regret, about choices made and not made, about the cost of safety, when what you really need is courage. He paused. Eleanor and I could have been more than friends. She knew it. I knew it. But she was never ready to let Jonathan go, even after all those years. And that's her big regret. Not that she loved Jonathan, but that she let that love become a wall instead of a foundation. After Floyd left, Mark sat alone with Eleanor's final letter. He built a fire in the library fireplace, poured himself coffee, and settled into the reading chair. Then he opened the envelope with careful hands. Dear Mark, it began. If Floyd has delivered this letter, it means you've been at the house for about a month. Long enough to discover my story, to understand what I'm asking of you, but hopefully not so long that you've started to follow my worst example. I'm going to be direct because I don't have time for subtlety. I lived my entire adult life alone. After Jonathan died, I convinced myself that loving someone that much once was enough for a lifetime, that opening myself to that kind of loss again would destroy me. So I built walls. I created a meaningful life, yes, but I lived it in isolation. Floyd was the closest I came to letting someone in. He was a good man, a kind man, someone I could have built something with if I'd been willing to try. But I wasn't. Even after all those years, I still held Jonathan so close that there was no room for anyone else. Don't do what I did, Mark. Don't mistake loyalty to the dead for a reason to stop living. Claire wouldn't want that. I never met her, but I know from watching you that she was someone who embraced life fully. She'd want you to do the same. I'm not saying forget her. I never forgot Jonathan. You've seen the evidence everywhere in this house. But I let memory become a prison instead of a foundation. You can honor Claire's memory while still building new relationships, new experiences, new chapters of your life. Now, about what I'm leaving you. By now you've found my will. You've seen the financial statements. You know the scope of what I'm passing on. It's substantial, more than you expected, I'm sure. The house and 40 acres are yours, free and clear. But there's more. Much more. I've left you my entire estate, Mark. All of it. The property, the investments, the financial holdings. As of my last accounting, the total value is approximately $847,000. I imagine you're overwhelmed right now. That's understandable. But listen carefully to why I'm doing this and what I'm asking in return. This money represents Jonathan's death benefits invested wisely over 70 years, plus my own savings from decades of nursing. I used portions of it to help others, but I was always careful to preserve the principle, to ensure the work could continue. That's your first responsibility. Continue the charitable work. I've left detailed lists of ongoing commitments, scholarships, medical bill assistance, family support. These are promises I made, and I'm trusting you to honor them. But here's the important part, the real reason I chose you, instead of leaving everything to an institution or splitting it among distant relatives. This isn't just about distributing money. It's about using this gift to rebuild your life. I've been watching from a distance for years, Mark. I saw how you loved Claire, how devoted you were during her illness. I saw your children's impatience with your grief. I knew that when she died, you would struggle. And I knew you would need something to anchor you, something to give you purpose when everything felt meaningless. This house, this money, this work, it's not just an inheritance. It's a lifeline. It's permission to rebuild your life around something meaningful. It's proof that even devastating loss can be transformed into something that helps others. But here's my condition, and it's more important than any legal requirement. Use this gift to stay engaged with life. Use it as a bridge to connect with people, to be part of the world, not a substitute for living. Help others, yes. Continue my work, yes. But don't make my mistake of doing it all from behind walls. Let people in, Mark. Let yourself be known and seen. Let yourself build new relationships without feeling like you're betraying what you had before. That's my real request. Not just that you continue my charitable work, but that you truly live while doing it. I made something beautiful here, but I made it alone, and that was my mistake. You have the chance to do what I couldn't, to grieve fully, to honor your loss, but then to open yourself to new connections, new possibilities, new love if it comes. The money gives you the resources to build whatever your second chance looks like. Use it wisely. Use it generously. But most importantly, use it as a tool for engagement, not isolation. I'm trusting you with everything I built, Mark. Honor that trust by being braver than I was. With love and hope for your future, Eleanor. Mark read the letter 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of Eleanor's intention. She'd left him everything, not just the house, but her life's accumulated wealth. Nearly $1 million, built from Jonathan's death benefits and 70 years of careful stewardship. The responsibility was enormous. But so was the gift. Mark set the letter down and pulled out his phone. He called Brian. "Dad, everything okay?" "I need to tell you something. Eleanor left me more than I initially thought. Much more." He explained about the letter, about the full extent of Eleanor's estate, about her explicit instructions for how it should be used. Brian listened without interrupting, his accountant's mind probably already organizing the information. "That's a significant amount, Dad. We'll need to move quickly on the foundation setup. Get the legal structure in place, reinstate those ongoing commitments immediately. Some of those families have probably been wondering why the support stopped." "I know. I've been thinking about that constantly. I'll call Patricia tomorrow, expedite everything. We can get temporary payments set up through your personal account until the foundation is established." Brian paused. "How are you feeling about all this?" "Overwhelmed, honored, terrified." Mark looked around the library. "Eleanor didn't just leave me money. She left me a mission, a purpose, a reason to keep going. That's what you needed." "Yes, but she also left me a warning about isolation, about building walls, about mistaking safety for living. She's asking me to do something much harder than managing money." "What's that?" "To stay open, to let people in, to use this gift as a bridge back to life, not a fortress to hide behind." After hanging up, Mark walked through the house, seeing it with new understanding. Every room, every choice Eleanor had made, every piece of preserved history. It was all his now. The responsibility of it pressed down on him, but underneath the weight was something else. Hope. Possibility. The sense that he'd been given not just resources, but permission to rebuild his life. The next 3 weeks passed in intense activity. Mark met with Patricia multiple times, signing papers, establishing the Eleanor Ridley Foundation's legal structure, setting up bank accounts and payment systems. Brian worked alongside him, managing the financial details with his characteristic precision. They reinstated all of Eleanor's ongoing commitments. The scholarship payments resumed. The medical bill assistance started flowing again. The housing support continued. Mark sent personal letters to each recipient, explaining the brief interruption and assuring them that Eleanor's promises would be honored in full. The responses moved him deeply. A college student wrote about nearly dropping out when the scholarship payments stopped, about the relief of being able to continue her nursing degree. A single father wrote about his terror when the medical bill assistance disappeared, about what it meant to know it would continue. Each letter represented a life touched, a burden lifted, a hope maintained. Mark also made a decision that surprised himself. He called the community center and asked about grief support groups. A woman on the phone gave him information about a group that met Tuesday evenings. "It's a good group," she said. "Very supportive. A lot of people who've lost spouses." "I'll think about it," Mark said, but he'd already decided to go. That Tuesday, Mark drove into town for the first time since Floyd's visit. The community center was a modest building near the library, warm and welcoming inside. About 15 people sat in a circle in a small meeting room. Mark took a seat, his heart pounding. An older man who introduced himself as the facilitator welcomed Mark and asked if he wanted to share anything. "I'm Mark. My wife died 8 months ago. This is my first time at something like this." "Welcome, Mark. There's no pressure to share more than you're comfortable with." As the meeting progressed, Mark listened to others tell their stories. A woman whose husband had died in a car accident. A man whose wife had passed from Alzheimer's. A younger woman who'd lost her partner to suicide. Each story was different, but the thread of grief bound them all together. A woman about Mark's age spoke near the end. "I'm Helen. My husband died 3 years ago from cancer. I still have hard days, but it's gotten easier to carry. Coming here helped me realize I wasn't alone in this." After the meeting, Helen approached Mark. "First time is always the hardest. But you came. That's what matters." It felt important to try, to not isolate myself. That's wise. Isolation makes everything harder. Helen smiled gently. "There's usually coffee afterward at the diner across the street. A few of us go. You're welcome to join if you'd like." Mark almost said no. His instinct was to retreat to the safety of Eleanor's house, to the familiar solitude. But then he thought about Eleanor's letter, her warning against the walls she'd built. "I'd like that," he said. At the diner, Mark found himself in conversation with Helen and 2 others from the group. They talked about grief, yes, but also about ordinary things, books they were reading, projects they were working on, the challenges of daily life. It felt normal in a way Mark hadn't experienced in months. Helen told him about teaching art at the local college. "It saved me after my husband died, having to show up for students, having to be present for something outside my own pain. It pulled me back into the world." "I'm learning that," Mark said. "Purpose helps. Connection helps." They do, but it takes time to be ready for them. As Mark drove back to the house that night, he felt different. Lighter, somehow. The conversation at the diner had been simple, but significant. Proof that he could engage with people, could talk about something other than loss, could imagine a life that included new connections. Over the following days, Mark continued his work with the foundation while also making changes to the house. He cleared out some of Eleanor's older belongings, not erasing her presence, but making room for his own. He set up a proper office in the library for foundation work. He started planning what he'd plant in the gardens come spring. On Saturday, Denise called with a request. "Dad, my colleague at school is organizing a fundraiser for a student whose family lost everything in a fire. I mentioned what you're doing with Eleanor's foundation. She wondered if you might be able to help." Mark thought about Eleanor's list, about the families she'd supported after similar disasters. "Tell me about the family." Denise explained. A single mother with 2 young children, lost their home and most possessions, struggling to find stable housing while working full-time. "I'd like to help," Mark said. "And Denise? I'd like to come to the fundraiser too, if that's appropriate." "Really?" "Dad, that would be wonderful. It's next Saturday at the school." After hanging up, Mark felt both anxious and determined. This would be his first public appearance in his new role, his first real step into the community as someone other than the grieving widower hiding in a big house. It scared him. But Eleanor's words echoed in his mind. "Be braver than I was." That evening, Mark sat in the East Wing and wrote in the journal he'd started keeping beside Eleanor's. "Dear Eleanor, I'm trying to do what you asked. I went to a grief support group this week. Met people who understand what it's like to lose someone you built your life around. One woman, Helen, invited me for coffee afterward. We talked. Just talked. About ordinary things and grief and the work of rebuilding. I'm scared of opening up, scared of risking my heart again. But I'm also starting to understand what you were trying to tell me. That staying closed off isn't protection, it's imprisonment. That honor doesn't require isolation. Next week, I'm going to a fundraiser at Denise's school. I'll meet people, engage with the community, represent the foundation publicly. It feels enormous, but also necessary. You left me more than money and property. You left me an example, both of what to do and what not to do. The charitable work, yes. The devotion to memory, yes. But not the walls. Not the decades of loneliness that you recognized too late as a choice rather than fate. I'm choosing differently. It's hard and uncomfortable, and sometimes I want to retreat back into solitude. But I keep pushing forward, keep saying yes when my instinct is to say no. Thank you for your faith in me, for believing I could do this, even when I didn't believe it myself. I hope I'm making you proud. With gratitude, Mark. Saturday arrived with clear skies and unseasonably warm weather for late winter. Mark drove to the city, his first real return since he'd fled to Eleanor's house months ago. The drive felt different now, not an escape, but a choice. A deliberate engagement with the world he'd been hiding from. The high school gymnasium was packed with families, students, and community members. Tables lined the walls displaying donated items for auction, baked goods for sale, information about the family being helped. Mark felt overwhelmed by the noise and crowd after weeks of relative solitude, but he pushed through the discomfort. Denise spotted him immediately and rushed over. "Dad, you came!" I said I would. She hugged him tightly, relief evident in her grip. "Come meet everyone." Mark met Denise's colleagues, the school principal, several parents who'd organized the event. Everyone was friendly, welcoming, curious about this father Denise had mentioned who was doing charitable work. Mark found himself explaining about Eleanor, about the foundation, about continuing her legacy of helping families in need. Then, Denise led him to the family at the center of it all, a woman named Grace, probably in her early 40s, exhausted, but holding herself together with visible effort. Her 2 children, a boy of about 10 and a girl of 7, stayed close to their mother, their eyes wide, taking in all the attention and support. "This is my father, Mark Ridley," Denise said. "He wanted to help." Grace shook his hand, her grip firm despite the fatigue in her eyes. "Thank you for coming. It means a lot that Denise's family would support us like this." Mark found himself saying, "My aunt spent her life helping families in situations like yours. I'm continuing her work. I'd like to cover your housing costs while you get back on your feet, and anything the children need. Clothes, school supplies, whatever was lost in the fire." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know what to say. We've been staying with my sister, 5 of us in her 2-bedroom apartment. I've been trying to save for a deposit on a place of our own, but everything goes to replacing what we lost." "You don't need to explain. Just accept the help. That's what the foundation is for." Mark spent time talking with Grace's children, too, learning about their interests, what they missed most from the fire. The boy, Thomas, had lost his entire collection of books. The girl, Amy, talked about her art supplies burning up. Mark made mental notes, planning to replace not just necessities, but the things that brought them joy. As the afternoon progressed, Mark found himself in conversation after conversation. A teacher named Ruth shared her struggles with affording classroom supplies on her salary, how she spent hundreds of dollars of her own money each year on materials for students whose families couldn't provide them. A parent talked about her elderly mother's mounting medical bills, the impossible choice between her mother's care and her own children's needs. A veteran mentioned the difficulty navigating disability claims, the bureaucratic maze that left him struggling financially while waiting for benefits he'd earned. Each conversation opened a window into lives being lived with courage and difficulty, people managing challenges Mark had never had to face. He listened, really listened. And in listening, he felt something long dormant begin to wake. A sense of connection to the wider world, to the community of human struggle and resilience. He made notes on his phone, adding names and situations to the Foundation's consideration list. Ruth's classroom needs, the elderly mother's medical bills, the veteran's financial gap. Each one represented an opportunity to help, to make Eleanor's legacy continue growing. During a quiet moment, a woman about his age approached. She had kind eyes and silver hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, laugh lines around her eyes that suggested someone who chose joy despite whatever sorrows she'd known. "You're Denise's father?" "I am." "Mark Ridley." "Helen Morrison. I teach with Denise." She paused, her expression softening. "She mentioned you'd lost your wife recently." "I'm sorry." Mark studied her face, saw genuine empathy there, not pity or awkward sympathy. "Thank you. My husband died 3 years ago. Cancer. So I understand something of what you're going through." Recognition sparked. "Helen from the grief group?" Her face brightened with surprise. "You're the Mark from Tuesday. I didn't make the connection with Denise's last name. It's good to see you here. It takes courage to show up like this. I'm learning that hiding doesn't help, that engagement, even when it's uncomfortable, is better than isolation." They talked for several minutes, the conversation flowing easily between two people who shared the common language of loss. Helen told him more about her husband, about their 25 years together, about the art therapy that had helped her through the worst of the grief. Mark told her about Eleanor, about the house, about learning to transform grief into purpose through the Foundation work. "That's remarkable," Helen said. "Using inheritance to help others while healing yourself. Your aunt sounds like she was an extraordinary woman." She was, though I'm only learning that now, after her death. I knew her as a kind aunt who lived alone. I didn't know about the love story that shaped her life, the wartime heroism, the decades of quiet generosity. It's like discovering a whole person I never knew existed. Sometimes that's when we really see people, when we can look at their whole lives instead of just the moments we shared with them. Helen glanced across the gym to where her students were managing the bake sale table. I should get back to supervising, but I'm glad we got to talk outside of group. It's nice to see you engaging with the world. As the event wound down, Mark wrote a substantial check to the fundraiser, then another to the school's general fund for Ruth's classroom supplies and other teacher needs. Denise walked him to his truck, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the parking lot. "Dad, what you did today, for Grace's family, for the school, that was really something." Eleanor would have done the same. Actually, she probably did help families here over the years. Her reach was wider than I realized. But you're not Eleanor. You're choosing this yourself. You're not just following her instructions. You're making it your own. Denise leaned against the truck. You seem different. More present somehow. More like yourself again. I'm trying to be. Eleanor left me more than just money and property. She left me an example of how to transform loss into purpose, and a warning about the cost of isolation, about building walls so high that nothing can get through them. You're not isolated. You have us, and I noticed you talking with Helen quite a bit. Mark smiled slightly. She's from the grief support group I've been attending. It helps, talking with someone who understands what this journey is like. I'm glad you're doing that. Going to group, engaging with people, helping families like Grace. Mum would be so proud of you. Driving back to Eleanor's house that evening, Mark felt exhausted, but in a good way. He'd engaged with the world, had connected with people, had made a tangible difference in Grace's life and the school's resources. It felt right. It felt like honoring both Eleanor and Claire, like building something meaningful from the foundation of his grief. But more than that, talking with Helen had shown him something unexpected, that it was possible to discuss loss with someone who understood it, to share that burden without it crushing you. He wasn't ready for anything beyond friendship, might not be ready for years. But the fact that he could imagine having that conversation again, could see himself continuing to attend the support group, and maybe even getting coffee with Helen outside of it. That felt like progress. Back at the house, Mark built a fire and sat in the library with Eleanor's journals. He'd been reading them chronologically over the past weeks, but tonight he wanted to understand something specific. He searched for entries about Floyd, about their friendship, about Eleanor's awareness of what she was choosing not to pursue. He found what he was looking for in an entry from 2005, 15 years into their weekly chess games. Floyd asked me to dinner tonight. Not chess and coffee, but an actual dinner. I could see in his eyes what he was offering. Companionship, maybe more if I was willing. I said no, gently as I could. Floyd accepted graciously, said we could continue our chess games if I was comfortable with that. I am comfortable with chess. Chess is safe. Chess doesn't require opening your heart or risking carefully constructed walls. He's a good man, kind, patient, someone who understands loss because he's lived through it. In another life, in another version of myself, I could have said yes. But Jonathan still owns too much of my heart, even 58 years after his death. That's loyalty or cowardice, depending on how you look at it. Maybe both. I wonder what Jonathan would think of my devotion. Would he be honored or heartbroken? Would he want me to have spent my life alone? I suspect if our positions were reversed, if I'd died and he'd survived, he would have mourned me deeply, but eventually built a new life. He was braver than I am, more willing to risk his heart. Mark closed the journal and stared into the fire. Eleanor had known exactly what she was choosing and what she was giving up. And in the end, she'd regretted it enough to warn him against making the same choice. He thought about Helen, about the easy conversation they'd had, the understanding that flowed between people who'd survived similar losses. He thought about Claire, about what she would want for him. She'd been generous, warm, someone who believed in embracing life fully. She wouldn't want him to spend the next 30 years alone in this house, no matter how noble the work he was doing. Mark spent Sunday working in Eleanor's garden, the one beyond Jonathan's memorial, where she'd talked to him while tending growing things. The ground was still mostly frozen, but he could clear away dead growth, prune back overgrown shrubs, begin planning what he might plant come spring. As he worked, he found himself doing what Eleanor had done, talking aloud. To Claire, telling her about the foundation, about reconnecting with Brian and Denise, about the family he'd helped at the fundraiser. To Eleanor, thanking her for the gift of purpose, for the warning against isolation, for seeing him clearly enough to know what he'd need. And gradually, without planning it, he talked to himself, acknowledging his fear of moving forward, his guilt about feeling anything beyond grief, his uncertainty about who he was becoming. "I loved her so much," Mark said to the cold air, his breath visible in the morning chill. "I still love her, but I'm starting to understand that love doesn't have to be a cage. Eleanor loved Jonathan her whole life, but she made it a cage. She built beautiful things around that cage. This house, the gardens, the charitable work, but she was still imprisoned by it. I don't have to do that. I can love Claire forever and still be open to whatever comes next." The words felt both true and terrifying, but speaking them aloud made them real, made them possible. That evening, he attended the Tuesday grief group again. Helen was there, and afterward several of them went to the diner, as had become customary. The conversation was easier this time, more natural. Mark found himself laughing at a story someone told about their late spouse's terrible cooking, then feeling a flash of guilt before remembering that laughter wasn't betrayal. Over coffee, Helen mentioned she was organizing a small art show at the college where she taught. It's student work, but some of it is really remarkable. They're exploring themes of loss and recovery, destruction and renewal. You might find it interesting, given what you're working through. You're welcome to come if you'd like. Next Friday evening. Mark's first instinct was to decline, to retreat to the safety of Eleanor's house and his solitary routine. But he thought about Eleanor's letter, about choosing engagement over safety, about being braver than she had been. "I'd like that," he said, surprising himself with how much he meant it. The week passed in continued activity. Mark finalized the foundation paperwork with Patricia, approved the first round of new grants beyond Eleanor's existing commitments, and met with Floyd to discuss hiring a part-time administrator to help manage the growing workload. "You're doing good work here," Floyd said over coffee in Mark's library, looking at the organizational charts and grant schedules spread across the desk. "Eleanor would be pleased with how you've expanded her vision." "I hope so. I'm trying to honor her legacy while not repeating her mistakes." Floyd studied him with those wise old eyes. "You mean the isolation?" "Yes. She warned me explicitly not to do what she did, to stay open to life, to people, to possibility. She talked to me about that toward the end, about regrets, about wishing she'd been braver when I'd asked her to dinner all those years ago." Floyd smiled sadly. "I understood her choice. After losing someone that deeply, opening up again feels like tempting fate. But I think she came to see it differently as she got older, saw it as fear dressed up as loyalty. That's exactly what it was, and she didn't want me to make the same mistake. For what it's worth, I think you're being brave, coming here, learning her story, continuing her work, engaging with the community. That takes real courage, especially when you're still raw from loss. Friday arrived, and Mark drove to the college for Helen's art show. The gallery was small, but well lit, filled with student paintings, sculptures, and photographs. Helen greeted him warmly, introduced him to several of her students, explained the context and inspiration of various pieces. Mark found himself genuinely interested, asking questions, engaging with the work in a way he hadn't engaged with anything beyond the foundation in months. One series of photographs caught his attention: landscapes after natural disasters, beauty emerging from destruction, flowers growing through ash, new trees sprouting from burned forests, light breaking through storm clouds. "That's one of my most talented students," Helen said, joining him in front of the photographs. "She lost her childhood home in a wildfire 2 years ago," Helen continued, gesturing to the photographs. "These are her way of processing that loss, finding moments of renewal and growth in the aftermath, art as a form of healing." "It's powerful," Mark said, studying an image of bright green shoots emerging from blackened earth. Transformation of grief into something beautiful. That's what Eleanor did too, in her own way. What I'm trying to do with the foundation. It's what we all have to do, eventually. Find ways to let the loss become something other than just absence. Helen moved to the next series of works. Otherwise, we just carry emptiness forever. They walked through the gallery together, Helen explaining the students' processes, their journeys through various forms of loss and recovery. Mark shared more about Eleanor, about the journals and letters, about discovering her hidden life and the love story that had shaped 70 years of choices. "It's like you inherited not just her money but her wisdom," Helen observed, "the lessons she learned too late to fully apply to her own life." "That's exactly what it feels like. She gave me a road map, showed me both what to do and what to avoid. The charitable work, yes. The devotion to memory, yes. But not the walls. Not the decades of loneliness that she recognized too late as a choice rather than fate." They talked for over an hour, long after most of the other attendees had left, about art and grief and the different ways people found to survive devastating experiences, about the danger of mistaking safety for healing, about the courage required to stay open to life when life had already taken so much. As the gallery began to close, Helen walked Mark to the parking lot. The spring evening was mild, the air sweet with the scent of blooming trees on campus. "I'm glad you came tonight, Mark. So am I. Thank you for inviting me, for thinking I might appreciate this. I hope this doesn't sound forward, but I value our conversations, both at group and outside it. It's rare to meet someone who understands grief deeply, but hasn't let it make them bitter or closed off. I'm not sure I'm as far along as that sounds. Most days I'm just trying to get through without drowning. Some days I don't even manage that. That's further along than you think. You're still showing up, still engaging, still helping others while you're struggling yourself." Helen paused, seemed to gather courage. "Mark, would you like to have coffee sometime? Not at the diner after group, but just the two of us, as friends who understand each other." Mark felt fear spike through him, the familiar instinct to retreat to safety. But he also felt something else: curiosity, connection, the possibility of building something new without betraying what he'd had before. He thought about Claire, about how she'd always encouraged him to try new things, to take risks, to engage with life. He thought about Eleanor's warning against isolation, against letting fear masquerade as loyalty. "I'd like that," he said, and was surprised by how much he meant it. 3 months had passed since Mark found Eleanor's will, since he'd accepted the weight and gift of her legacy. Spring had fully arrived at the estate, transforming the grounds from winter's stark beauty into something alive and burgeoning with possibility. Mark stood in Eleanor's garden, his garden now, he'd learned to think of it, surveying the work he'd done. The raised beds were planted with vegetables and herbs. The trellises held climbing roses in full bloom, their white flowers a tribute to Jonathan's memory. In the center, where Eleanor's fountain had once stood, Mark had installed a simple stone bench with a brass plaque, in memory of Claire Ridley, who loved growing things. He visited Jonathan's memorial regularly too, keeping the roses trimmed and healthy, clearing debris, maintaining the peaceful space Eleanor had created. He talked to Jonathan sometimes, telling him about Eleanor's life, about how her love for him had become something that helped thousands of people over decades, about how, even in death, they were still teaching people about love and loss and transformation. The Eleanor Ridley Foundation was fully operational now. Patricia had structured it efficiently, with Brian serving as treasurer and Denise helping with grant applications and family vetting. Mark met with recipients personally when possible, hearing their stories, understanding their needs beyond the financial. It was exactly what Eleanor had wanted. Not anonymous charity, but genuine connection through helping. Grace's family was in stable housing now, the children thriving at school. Thomas had a new collection of books, and Amy had art supplies that she used to create paintings she gave to Mark as thank you gifts. The scholarship students Eleanor had supported wrote regularly with updates on their progress, graduations, new jobs, families of their own starting. New families received help every month, medical bills paid, education funded, housing crises averted. The foundation's work spread through the community like ripples from a stone dropped in still water, touching lives in ways Mark was only beginning to understand. Mark attended the grief support group every Tuesday evening without fail. Helen was always there, and they'd become close friends. They had coffee regularly now, long conversations about loss and life and the work of rebuilding. Just friends, though Brian kept asking with poorly concealed hope if it was more than that. Mark wasn't ready for more, might never be ready. But he valued the friendship deeply, the ability to talk honestly with someone who understood grief intimately without being consumed by it. Brian and Denise visited often, sometimes together, sometimes separately, sometimes with their families for weekend gatherings that filled the house with laughter and life. The rift that had opened between them was healing, the wound closing into a scar that was tender, but no longer bleeding. They'd learned to talk about Claire without it triggering arguments about grief and timelines, and whose pain was more legitimate. They'd learned to see Mark as someone navigating loss rather than someone failing to cope with it, and he'd learned to see them as fellow travelers through grief rather than judges of his journey. On a warm Saturday in early May, the entire family came to the estate for the day. Brian's children ran through the gardens, delighted by the space and freedom, by the creek and the woods, and the sense of endless territory to explore. Denise's daughter Sophie helped Mark plant marigolds along the path to the house, her small hands carefully pressing soil around each flower, while Mark told her about her grandmother's love of gardens. The adults sat on the restored back porch, drinking iced tea and talking about everything and nothing. About the foundation's growing reach, about Brian's promotion at work, about Denise's plans for summer reading programs at school, about the ordinary, beautiful minutiae of lives being lived forward instead of backward. This place has really come together, Dad, Brian said, looking out at the grounds with obvious admiration. Eleanor would be proud of what you've built here. I hope so. Though really, I'm just continuing what she started. The foundation, the gardens, the work of helping people, it's all her vision. I'm just the steward. Don't sell yourself short. Eleanor gave you the tools, but you're the one who chose to use them. You could have just sold the property, taken the money, and lived comfortably without all this effort. That wouldn't have honored her. Or Claire. Mark sipped his tea, watched Sophie chase butterflies through the garden.